Hello, welcome back to my channel. So today I want to do a video all about the INTJ personality type. I want to talk about their strengths and their weaknesses and their cognitive functions. And specifically, I want to dive into this matrix that I have here. So this is a overused, underused, strength, weakness matrix. So I'm going to go through for the INTJ, what is their overused strength, their overused weakness, and so on and so forth, to really dive into what are the motivations of the INTJ and get deeper beyond behavior, but really into kind of like the psyche of the type. So if you don't know what a cognitive function is, that's going to be really important to this video. So Myers Briggs came after what Carl Jung coined in 1921, which are the cognitive functions. So these are the 8 cognitive functions listed here. This is by no means exhaustive, and I have deep dives going into Carl Jung's writing about each of these cognitive functions, but it can be kind of a starting point for which function calls out to you, because the online tests are very unreliable. So I wouldn't get too attached to whatever result you got on an online test. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. I know, a lot of instances of both. So I would actually just look into the cognitive functions and type yourself in that way. So all of the 16 personalities use all 8 of the cognitive functions in a specific order, in a specific way, which gives them a specific flavor. So for the INTJ, this is the order that they use these cognitive functions in, and I have the abbreviations listed here. So loosely speaking, this is descending in order of importance to which functions the INTJ values within themselves and in others. And also loosely speaking, this is descending in chronological order at which these get developed within the personality type. So, there's kind of some debate about it, but maybe by the time you're like 16 or so, the personality is more solidified. And then there are different phases that they kind of can become strengths. So, your first function's been with you your whole life, then maybe teens, 20s, that second function takes a more prominent role, your 30s, your third function, your 40s, your fourth function, and so on. So to add some nuance to this, your top 4 functions are conscious to you, like you're conscious of when you use them, and you value them. You value them in yourself and in others. The bottom 4 functions, you're not really conscious of when you use them, and you also don't, as a default, value it in yourself and in others. And to add more nuance to this, the functions in green, 1, 2, 5, and 6, are your potential strengths, and the functions in red, 3, 4, 7, and 8, are your probable weaknesses. So I put potential and probable because it's not 100% of the time, but there's a strong likelihood that as a default, especially if you're like someone in your 20s, which a lot of my viewers are, there's every likelihood that this is kind of the default of how things are working. So getting back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the video, that strengths, weakness, overused, underused matrix. So your top 4 functions are where that matrix lives. And because your top 4 functions are both conscious and value, there's a lot of meat to unpack there. So I'm going to spend this video going deep into the INTJ personality, going through their overused and underused strengths. So as we go on, if you're curious about where I got some of this information, this slide right here is from a previous video where I did a deep dive into Carl Jung's writing and John Beebe and Myers Briggs and what they said about the different functions in the different positions. And then I summarized those quotes in these bullet points in that video. So if you want to pause it, if you're curious where I get some of this, you can pause it and take a look at this here, but I'm not going to go into it just because it is in a separate video. Okay, so your first cognitive function is Introverted Intuition, or abbreviated NI. So the word introvert means to turn inward, vert means to turn, intro means inward. So introvert doesn't necessarily mean being alone or being around a bunch of people. Carl Jung coined the words introvert and extrovert, and he got those words from Benet's words introspection and externospection, which means spect means to watch over. So watch over what's happening inwardly or watch over what's happening outwardly. Now, it's certainly easier to introspect and reflect when you're alone, but it's not required. You could be in a room of 40 people, you tune them all out, and you turn inward to what you're thinking about. So alone time is not necessitated for introversion. It's just turning inward and introspecting. In the same way that you could be alone and you might not be introspecting or deeply reflecting. You could just be watching Netflix, you're turning outward and watching the screen. So you're not doing any meaningful introversion. So I want to clarify the definition there. So introverted intuition. So introverted means to turn inward, and there's a lot of different things you could turn inward toward, your thoughts, your feelings, but in this case of introverted intuition, it's turning inward toward the intuitions. And intuition is the opposite of sensing. So sensing is, what you have experienced or what you are experiencing with your senses. You're experiencing what exists in reality. So intuition is the opposite of that. You're experiencing what is not in reality, what does not exist, what has never been in existence. So it's not a memory. So this could be the future. This is a vision of something that hasn't happened. This could be an idea, but it's the connections between things. So it's things that are not in existence that you are calling to mind and doing an internal processing of those things. So for an INTJ, this is your number 1 strength. This is your overused strength in that strengths weakness matrix. So this as an INTJ, this is the function that's been with you your whole life. So as a child, you should see evidence of yourself using this function. It's the function that you have a compulsion to use. Carl Jung talks about that's basically never stagnates. And this function seeps out into every area of your life. You're just doing it all the time, at work and at home and in recreation. There's this constant pull toward this realm. So in a previous series I did where I did deep dives into all these cognitive functions, I went through and looked at what are the words that are used over and over again. And for introverted intuition, the word is vision, seeing the image within the mind or the vision within the mind. And it talks about how it chases the vision deeper and deeper. Whereas extroverted intuition, it's expanding. I'll try this project and this project and try this project and try this project, and it's hopping around. This is in the mind, chasing the one thing deeper and deeper, as opposed to externally chasing many things. It's chasing the one vision in the mind. And so there are quotes that it internally sees what doesn't exist. So this could be the vision. This could be internal connections. It's if sensing is kind of the lines that you're reading on the page, intuition is then reading in between the lines. It's what's not in existence, the internal connection you're making. Insight or purpose. The word purpose came up a lot in the introverted intuition section because it's very focused on the future path, and that a way that gets summarized is purpose. There was a quote that introverted intuition seeks to transform the vision into its own life. And so there were quotes about it sees the course of things, it sees the clear outline of things, it sees the way they want to go, it sees the correct direction or the wrong direction. So there's this huge emphasis on this life path or this life course. So I've got this image in the bottom right of this person, just kind of walking, and it's like seeing that in your mind, this path. Or in the bottom right, those checkpoints, it's this clear outline, this will lead to this. And when a function is your dominant function, you see it in an optimistic way. So it's not like, oh, the future's going on a bad path, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. No, it's the purpose. It's not meditating on purposelessness. Like sometimes NI third can do some of that, but it's really focusing on the purpose and, seeing the value of the future. For introverted intuition, there were quotes about that the communication is a lot of symbols and paradox. And when I'm trying to approximate what introverted intuition is, I've got this spiral in the bottom left. It just feels like you're going deeper and deeper into this image, or kind of this yin yang, or, this seeing eye, it's just these symbols that are kind of approximating the thing. And so the communication style can be very approximating and vague. In contrast to introverted sensing, there are so many details in the communication style. There are quotes about introverted intuition having this prophetic prevision or feeling at home in spiritual things and being very futuristic. It's a very futuristic outlook, this course of how things are going to go, the vision of how things are going to go. I've got this picture down here. I was trying to find pictures of people, kind of introspecting about the future, and this is the best graphic I could find. So she's kind of imagining herself having this doctoral degree. It's a little less, that image is not really clearly encapsulating how it's this path kind of, and it's maybe a little more vague than that. It's a little bit more ethereal than that. Or I've got this person in the top right, kind of meditating. There's nothing in that thought bubble, but meditating on the vision, meditating on the future. All the introverted functions will meditate on something, whether that's the thoughts or the feelings. But for introverted intuition, it's meditating on the vision. Introverted intuition perceives the ideal inner life in general. So it does a lot of thinking about inner life in general, meaning in general, purpose in general. It talks about people's inner life in general, themes of inner life, themes of meaning. That's something that becomes very important to introverted intuition. So this is your dominant function. So as such, that if you feel like you're kind of down or not feeling like yourself, it could be that you're not making space for this function. And this function is so, detached from reality. It's introverted, which already makes it a little detached. And then it's this intuition function, which is very detached. So it's hard to make space for this function. And so I found that a lot of times INJs maybe haven't built an environment that really values this function. So this is the function that it just never stagnates. So you would constantly find yourself kind of drifting off and thinking about the future, drifting off and thinking about the meaning, detached from what was happening, not finding meaning within what's happening, but detached from what's happening. So this is the function that from a young age as an INTJ, you would have been doing this your whole life as a little child. And this function is very detached from the body. So a lot of times I'll hear like parents of INJs say that as little children, they were just very still, not moving very much, as opposed to like EPs, like very high energy children a lot of times. But this function's been with you your whole life, so very still, sitting and meditating. So Carl Jung talks about the dangers of one-sidedness, being too introverted or too extroverted, and I have videos about loops and kind of this one-sidedness as well if you're interested in that topic. But Carl Jung talks about the introversion gives you access to the self and reflection, that if you're doing introversion well, you really know yourself, you're reflecting, you're introspecting, and really you have this deep access to yourself. But he talks about that you're kind of one-dimensional when you're just that dominant function. You're kind of lacking complexity. So over time, this second function will be developed. And for INTJs, it's extroverted thinking. So we're talking like teens that started to come on the scene a little bit more, this extroverted thinking. And all the extroverted functions give you access to the world and action taking. And so, like I said before, extroversion is not just being around a bunch of people, but it's access to the world and action taking. Now, the world includes people, but people are just a subset of what the world is. So your second cognitive function is extroverted thinking, or abbreviated TE. So extrovert means to turn outward and watch what's happening outwardly. And there's a lot of things you could be watching outwardly. You could be paying attention to people's feelings. You could be paying attention to the sensory things. But in this case, when you look outwardly, you're looking at the logical environment. So a lot of times that's looking at resources that we share communally. Like we talk about time, we talk about money, or we talk about goals. So a lot of times it comes down to logistics. In contrast with introverted thinking, which is a lot more logic-based, it's turning inward and how do I think about this thing? This is the extroverted version of that. So it's all about kind of resource management externally, and a lot of times that will come down to logistics. That's not all of what it is, but it comes down to logistical systems and things like that. So everyone's second function is their underused strength, and Carl Jung talks about this function tends to be neglected. So this function can tend to be kind of watered down, like maybe as a default you're not getting the full strength of the function. A lot of times people, like if you're an introvert in this case, a lot of times people will use this second function in an introverted way. They'll kind of take some qualities of extroverted thinking, but then they'll do it in a very introverted way. They'll still be like reflecting inwardly about these type of things. Or sometimes people will use this in just one very small area of their life. They're like, yeah, I use TE at work, but I don't use it with my family. I don't use it in recreation. I don't use it, Whereas your first function, it just seeps out into every area of life. And so Carl Jung talks about this function adds a lot of complexity to the type. It gives you access to the world and action taking. And so this function adds a lot of range and prospect. I've heard a lot of people, including myself, share really good things about when they finally got into their second function, because this is the next strength. This is like the biggest bang for your buck area. So the number one word used by Carl Jung for extroverted thinking was systems. And so there were lots of different ways that he used the word systems, but one is like creating a thought system. It talks about that extroverted thinking constructs via synthesis. So the way that extroverted thinking it'll get information from here, get information from here, gets information from here, and then Carl Jung talks about it will construct and build a new thing based on this synthesis. Whereas like introverted thinking, it kind of goes in and questions, and that's how it creates. But extroverted thinking will take a little bit from here, a little bit from here, a little bit from here, organize that in an efficient way, and then it's this new own thing that it constructed. And so extroverted thinking is very constructive. It doesn't want to destruct, which is kind of another difference between TI and TE. TI and FI are both looking at where are we falling short, and let's tear down anything that's not quite right. TE and FE are kind of willing to ignore the things that are not quite right for the sake of constructing. So some types of systems that I wanted to mention, if you are an INTJ and you haven't read the book Getting Things Done, I abbreviated it GTD, that's kind of the TE Bible right there. So I would get that book. Some of the things are a little outdated. It came out before there was a lot of like digital things, but you can kind of change them digitally. So there's an emphasis on creating a lot of external systems. So this could be a project management system, a task management system, a money management system, a time management system, basically just all these different resource management systems, and getting really good at that. And a lot of times I notice that ITJs are really good at doing that at work. They really lean into that TE at work, but then they kind of let things slack at home, or if they're hanging out with a group of friends, a TE Dom, and people are like, hey, where do we want to go? And TE Doms are a lot of times like, oh, this place is here, this would be efficient, we can go here. And a lot of times they're kind of calling the shots that way, and you're posing an idea. Where I notice that ITJ is like, I'm not going to use my TE in the friend group setting, which TE is kind of a weird function to use in a friend group setting, but I think that's something to kind of spread that out a little bit more. So Carl Jung says that TE is thinking which attains visible form, or there's another quote that it's thinking which produces. So it always needs to have a result. So a lot of times ITJs can do TE in a very introverted way. So there's not actually tangible results that they're doing. So ITJs really need to get a little bit more into these results. That's kind of what the point is. It's not thinking about things, it's the results. Do you have results? So produces, outcomes, goals, results. Something I said, the results speak for themselves. So if you don't have a project, get one. So TE is very project-based, timelines. They stake an objective and put a lot of systematic goal to achieving it on schedule. Get yourself a project, set mile markers for yourself, and then get it done on schedule. And the results speak for themselves. I'll get into when I get into the introverted feeling section a little bit more, but sometimes introverted feeling will say things like, I have value in and of myself, and I don't need to prove my value to anyone. Other people don't understand, but I know I've got strong value. And that's, no. For the INJs, they have issues with FI and TI saying that I know better, even though the group isn't accepting my results. I know better. And you have to subordinate it, and TE has to be the boss and say, no, the results speak for themselves. Do you have results? No? Okay. Well, then it's not working. So that FI pride I'll talk about a little bit more, but the results have the final say. Do you have results or do you not have results? And that's what's got the final say. TE likes to be the organizer, authority, govern, likes to have decision-making power, basically a lot of leadership. So a lot of ITJs, they'll use their TE in kind of a organized way. You know, I'll be alone at my house and I organize my email. So I've got inbox 0 or something like that, which is a good, that's another system, an inbox 0 system. But having, leadership, actually the organizational, like the governing side of TE. A lot of the ITJs will kind of forget, like, oh, yeah, people are part of the world, so, organizing people, resource management, people are one of those resources. There's a lot of quotes about TE. It has a lot of progress, persistence, execution, very tough, determination. This is in contrast to FI, which I'll get to, but, not giving up so early, or when the going gets tough, keep going, building that persistence to maintain that progress. A lot of times FI will have these ideals, and then in the real world when it's not met, then FI is kind of like, I'm going to stagnate my activity. But no, you got to be tough, not sensitive, persistent execution, determination, keep that progress going. There's quotes of TE about speed, decisive, efficient, deciding things quickly. So one thing you'll hear from TE DOMs is the idea to fail fast. And so it's, you could think about something for a year and then you're like, oh, okay, I think I have the perfect way to do it. And meanwhile, it would have been faster to have, tried one thing, failed, tried another thing, failed, tried another thing, failed. And by acting and being out in the world and taking action, you learn more than you would have learned in that year. If you tried 20 things and they all failed, you learn so much more than if you just kind of sit there and you try to not fail. Yeah, in education, I read a lot of books about how failure makes you remember things more and learn things more. We called it FAIL, F-A-I-L, first attempt in learning. Like when I think about, I was in a spelling bee when I was in 4th grade and I got the word wrong, marmalade, and I will not forget how to spell the word marmalade. So failure makes it like more permanent in your brain. You remember something. So it's kind of vulnerable to fail, but it's better to just fail fast. You learn more. And one quote, I think it was a Covey quote, but it's that we're overeducated beyond the realm of our action. And I think for ITJs, that's very pertinent, that we'll use TE in the education way. Okay, I'll take in this information, I'll take in all this information, but not act on it. Reading business books, that's not extroverted enough. That's not in the world enough, acting enough. But just, okay, I'll read this business book and okay, good. That's a good principle. Now I know the principle. But no, it's not about knowing the principle. It's about taking the action step. So a rule that I made for myself was that at the end of every, like if there was a business book I was reading and I liked a principle, I would make an action step for myself and then don't read another chapter until I've acted on it. Test it out, because then you kind of remember things more. So I recommend that everyone work on their second function for an extended amount of time, like 5 years. Myers Briggs talk about that if you want to work on a function, you need to isolate it and work on just that one function, because there's a lot of mechanics of opposites going on here. So as soon as you work on one function, it's the opposite of this one and the opposite in a different way of this one. So you really want to focus on one and just work on it in that way. So this feels like, in my experience, this feels like coming home to yourself. Carl Jung says that your second function is of secondary importance. And it's, you're an INTJ. So you're losing a huge part of yourself if you want to get rid of this T function. So John Beebe calls this the parent function. He calls the second function the parent and the third function the child. And when you think about what a good parent does, it sets expectations for the child. They set expectations for themselves, boundaries for themselves. And there's maturity there. And there are quotes about how your second function is kind of where this maturity lives. And it's how you don't let yourself off the hook. A lot of times people kind of let themselves off the hook. They won't do the second function that much. But this is where you can build responsibility and be a more responsible person. And it feels like hard work. It feels like building a muscle. But ultimately, it's something that has a lot of future benefits. It's got future payoff, short-term work, but long-term payoff, as opposed to the third function is more like short-term reward, long-time bad results. And a lot of times you can mentor people in this function. Your first function, you're just like a natural at it, so sometimes it's hard to teach people something that you don't understand what's so hard about it. You're just a natural about it. Your second function, you have the capacity for it to be a skill, but you had to earn it, and you understand this is what's hard about it. I thought I could do this, but then I realized it was actually better to do this, and so you can go through the highs and lows, and then you can teach people that thing. So me, for example, I'm TE second, and I've got all these videos about project management. If you're interested in that, I have a set systems not goals video. If you're interested in that, you can just sort my channel by most popular. It's some of my 2 most popular videos, but it's teaching a lot of these getting things done principles and TE principles, because I kind of have read the stuff. I understood, what kind of the pitfalls are, and then you can really teach people that thing. Okay, so now getting into your third function, introverted feeling, or abbreviated FI. So everyone's third function is the direct opposite of their second function. So your second function's extroverted, this one's introverted. Since your second one is thinking, this one is feeling. So introverted feeling is your third function. And this is called a polarity, this opposite. It's like North Pole and South Pole. They are opposites of each other. And it's kind of a forced choice thing. You can either be at the North Pole or the South Pole, but you can't be at both at the same time. To try to be at the North Pole and the South time, you're just not getting the meaningful results of either of them. Or it's kind of like a light switch. The light switch is either flipped on to TE or it's flipped down to FI. So for every second you choose to be in FI, you're choosing not to be in TE, which Carl Jung talks about, that TE is of secondary importance for an INTJ. And Carl Jung also talks about the dangers of one-sidedness. If you choose to be an FI, you're always going to be an NI, and then if you choose to be an FI, that's incredibly one-sided in the self and reflection department. And too much of that one thing becomes just like navel-gazing, or, the more you do it, it doesn't mean it gets deeper because you run out of things to meaningfully reflect about, it just becomes this like staring at yourself. There's a quote about with Introverted Feeling, that it starts just feeling itself at one point. There's nothing left to feel. It's just getting down to this feeling yourself. So in the way that your second function is your underused strength, this one is your overused weakness. So it's the opposite in that regard. And also your second function is the parent, and this one's the child. And John Beebe talks about there's a lot of immaturity, there's cowardice, ego, haughty, in this function. And it cannot be expected to offer deep wisdom. Your second function is very mature. He talks about this third function, you cannot expect it to offer deep wisdom. In your 30s, this function will come up and become a little better, but it's never going to be expected to offer deep wisdom. There's always going to be a tendency to be pulled down in this function, and it's always going to be immature to some extent. So a lot of times people will go to this function if they're feeling defensive or insecure, or if they're in an argument, or just in a period of life where they're feeling kind of down. Basically, when you're feeling not like yourself, because you're an INTJ, not an INFJ. So this can make INTJs start kind of like not really feeling like themselves. So your third function is introverted feeling. So once again, we're in an introverted space. So it's to turn inward and process what's happening inwardly, to watch what's happening inwardly, to introspect. And in this case, it's introspecting and processing the feelings. This could be feelings, emotions, values, convictions, morals. So there's a lot going on with introverted feeling. So the number one word used with introverted feeling was moral, or misunderstood was used a lot as well. Something that can happen is you take the regulating nature with TE and the values, morals nature of FI, is you get this kind of regulating values and morals with the conviction and force of feeling with FI. So, I've seen INTJs, really almost like social justice warrior, online. And it's something where INTJs are not at their best when they talk about their values and morals. Everyone's third function is kind of like this bratty teenager, and it wants to be respected. And when you think about a bratty teenager, it's like, if I just push harder, then they'll respect me. They're not respecting me, but if I push harder, they'll respect me. And it's just the case that people are just not going to respect you in your third function. Like, you can keep trying, but it's just not going to happen. Meanwhile, people just will naturally respect your second function. It's just been so easy for me to get respect to my first and second functions, but that third function is just not going to be respected. So there are certain types that are made to talk about values and made to talk about their convictions, and it's just not the INTJ. That's more the FI Dom territory. So introverted feeling and introverted thinking are both looking at how we fall short of a standard. And in this case, introverted feeling is looking at wanting to have this world, this ideal world that falls into their moral standards. So they're always looking at how we're falling short. So it says that introverted feeling will take on an exaggeratedly critical point of view. Sometimes with an INTJ, the conversation is just revolving around this criticism. And there's a quote for the introverted feeling that you can feel the movement of feeling away from the object is the word he said, but I'll say the other. It's just, you can feel, it's like FI can be sometimes like a vacuum sucking all of the good feeling out of the room. And so, talking so critically about things, that can definitely contribute to it. I think sometimes FI types don't realize that these FE types are putting a lot of like kind of good vibes into the environment all the time. And FI just kind of, they don't expect that. That's an expectation. FI didn't ask anyone to put good vibes into the environment all the time. But that's what FE is doing. And so meanwhile, FI is sucking it up and not being conscious of that, but it is sucking, the smile, the warmth, the friendliness, the good vibe that's going on. It's kind of sucking it out of the room. Introverted feeling is attracted to problems of the emotional life. And so in the FI section, there were a variety of negative emotions, and especially any function in the third place is going to get the negative traits of the function more likely than the positive traits of the function. So resentment, melancholic, discouraged, sensitive. I'll go on to the next bullet point too, moods. And so their activity suffers due to moods of discouragement. They feel helpless. They feel that their goals are impossible. And one thing that can happen is I think that INTJs might use FI as an excuse. Now, I can't be productive right now because I've got this problem of the emotional life. Or no, I can't do this thing right now and it's almost an excuse. Like, I don't feel like doing it. There's this FI problem going on, so I can't TE right now because I've got this emotional problem going on. But it's just an excuse, it's kind of, bratty teenager, not taking responsibility. It's childish, it's immature. So it's important to subordinate it to TE, and TE will be the one making the decisions. FI and SE are still valuable components of the personality, but they should not be the ones making the decisions or given the priority. NI and TE should be those ones. There are quotes for introverted feeling. The feeling can never be fully comprehended. It can only be guessed at. And if shut off from expression, it will become miserable. And so this is the thing where I think sometimes if you're too NI-FI, it's like, I'm just going to process feelings and process feelings and process feelings and process feelings. And the thought is, I'll solve this problem at some point. I'll just keep processing, and then I'll get some resolution at the end of this. But the feeling is never going to be fully comprehended. The NI is going to be looking for all that insight. The FI just can never be fully comprehended. So then it can just become kind of miserable. And for all the time that you spend processing these emotions, that this tunnel that just never ends, you're not in TE. And so it's this opportunity cost. For every second you're in FI, you're not in TE, and so that becomes the problem. For the vast majority of people, I think it's great for people to process emotions. For almost all the other personality types, my advice is, yeah, you should be processing emotions. The ITJs are one of the few types where I say, no, you shouldn't. You don't need to be processing emotions so much. You got to get out of it, as well as some of the FI DOMs probably. But there's an overabundance of processing that's not yielding the results. For all the time spent in that processing, it's not yielding all those results. And a lot of times the moods are due to maybe a TE thing. Maybe the TE job isn't working out how they want it to work. The results aren't happening, so they get in this FI mood, which will stagnate them. As opposed to what would have been the better solution is to continue to be in TE and to continue to work to actually solve the problem. TE is what actually solves the problems for an INTJ. It's different for the different types, but FI is not going to solve your FI problems. Counterintuitively, TE is what solves the FI problems. Another thing is that FI can have arrogant ambition, a lot of obstinance, pride. The third position is already kind of this bratty teenager that it thinks it's better than it actually is. And now you have FI, which can be kind of a prideful, obstinate function with some arrogant ambition. So it's kind of a double dose of this pride. As well as there are quotes with Introverted Intuition about having a lot of pride. So it's a double dose there. So it's important to actually, get out in the world. What are the actual results? Not this mind castle on how great things are in the mind, but in reality, how are things actually going? Get into reality, get into TE. So one thing I've been saying in all these videos is that I think people's third function is what makes people involuntarily single. So if they're single but they don't want to be, because you want to be a mature person, you want to find a mature person, and the maturity does not live in this third function. It cannot be expected to offer deep wisdom. The maturity lives in that second function. So if you want to be a mature person and attract a mature person, it comes down to that second function. That's what's going to give you. People automatically respect your second function. The maturity is just evident. So it's important to allow that second function, the parent, to parent the child, that third function. For TE to say, okay, FI, we'll use you if we want to be creative or art, or we can express our emotions in an artistic way, or write a song, or write a poem or something. But we're not going to use you if you're going to make our activity stagnant, you're going to make us overly discouraged or exaggeratedly critical. So it's important for TE to parent FI and to get into work, get into a project, and to not do the bidding of the third. I think sometimes the third function can whisper at TE, like, hey, that struck one of our values. I didn't like that they said it. You better go argue my point. And so then the TE skills of being able to, construct a deductive argument, for example, will then be used at the behest of FI, but that's not the correct order. It needs to start with TE. The decision needs to originate with TE, and then TE can be the one delegating to FI, not the other way around. FI shouldn't be the one delegating the other functions to do things. Okay, getting into your fourth function, Extraverted Sensing, or abbreviated SE. So everyone's fourth function is the direct opposite of their first function. Since your first one is introverted, this one's extroverted. Since your first one is intuition, the opposite of that is sensing. So extroverted sensing is your fourth function. And once again, these are in polarity with one another. They're a pole. So one's the north pole, one's the south pole, or it's like a light switch. It can either be flipped on or it can be flipped off. But to try to have that light switch on and off at the same time, you just don't get a meaningful result. Or to try to be at the north pole and the south pole at the same time, you don't get a meaningful result. So this is your underused weakness. NI was your overused strength. So this one is your underused weakness. So this is the function that, because it's kind of a forced choose, you're either an NI or you're an SE. And because NI is your number one strength, it basically never stagnates. That means that you're hardly ever an SE. And it makes sense that you wouldn't be an SE very much, because this is what John Beebe calls your inferiority complex. This is a big weakness. And it's something where it's not as probably bad as you think it is, but it is a weakness nonetheless. So for a lot of people, they might be in their first function like 95% of the time, their fourth function 5% of the time. It's something that's very absent from the type. And your first function is your number one strength. So overall, that's fine. It's not a bad thing to be more an NI than an SE. But a lot of times types will create a prison for themselves within their first function. They'll say my first function and my first function only will get me what my first function wants. And so that ends up creating a different prison for each of the types. So for NI, it might be like meditating on the vision, and meditating on the vision only will get me this vision. But actually, if you just sit there and you think about something and you're detached from your body for so long, you're not actually going to realize the vision. It takes, all this action, SE, which will actually make it happen. So SE is kind of the key to unlock you out of that prison. So everyone's fourth function, John Beebe calls the inferiority complex. And you are bad at it. It is a weakness, but it's not as bad as people think that it is. It really is an inferiority complex. This is the function that tends to come on the scene, like in your 40s. If I look at people 40s and up, I see this evidence of this function a lot more. So the number one word used with extroverted sensing is sensation. And the quote with extroverted sensors is that life is the accumulation of experience with concrete objects. That's what life is. If you want the full zest of life, you need to accumulate experience with concrete objects. So, the DJ board, or spiking a volleyball, or, this nice leather jacket. Aesthetics can be a part of it. So, a very physical world. It's turning outward toward the sensory environment, and it's very involved in that sensory environment. It wants to amplify things. How can I make this more attractive? Or how can I make this music louder? Or how can I drive this car faster? Or make this food spicier? It's just the amplification of the sensory experience. So the quote with Introverted Intuition is that the bodily existence and its effect on others fades from view, and that Introverted Intuition can be unadapted to actual present-day reality. So if you're too much an NI, your bodily existence is fading from view, and that can be like not realizing facial expressions, not looking very attractive. But so if you get more Extroverted Sensing, then you're more in your body. Your facial expressions accurately reflect what's happening, or you care about the aesthetics, looking attractive. Something that I heard from Personality Hacker was that SE cares about the sizzle and NI cares about the steak, and you want both. So SE really cares about, kind of the advertisement, drawing people in, like, ooh, smell this steak, the sizzle of the steak, drawing someone in, making it look attractive. And the NI can help people bite into it, and there's like, this is really good. There's a lot of meat here. There's a depth there. If you're too NI, there's no attractiveness. There's nothing to lure people in. It might be a very interesting concept, a very deep, meaningful concept, but there's nothing luring people in. Introverted Intuition, there are quotes about having a lot of obstinacy, stubborn even in mistaken views, conceited. And Extroverted Sensing gives realism to the type. It doesn't overvalue or undervalue the self, but it's just realistic. It's also adaptable. Sometimes with Introverted Intuition, it's got this one path and everything else is wrong. And there's only the one path. It's a narrow path. So the vast majority of things are going to be wrong in the perspective of the Introverted Intuitive. But Extroverted Sensing gives some adaptability. Hey, maybe we could do it this way, or we could do it this way. And especially when dealing with people, like we don't need to be so stubborn, And what's real is better than conjecture. And sometimes with Introverted Intuition, it likes to make conjectures all the time. I wonder, I could see this being the pattern, or I could see this being the pattern. SE is like, let's make this real. Let's not just conjecture all the time. For Introverted Intuition, there's quotes about how there's no development of an outer personality or influence. This is what I see with INJs all the time. A lot of times just kind of stoic. You know, there are certain people that can be just kind of like annoying because they're so loud or so in your face or just a very big personality. INJs have the opposite issue of that. There's just no development of an outer personality. It's almost bordering on boring because they're just not showing personality to anyone. And so then they deprive themselves of influence. They haven't made themselves look attractive. This could be aesthetics or just the way they speak or communicate. So they're lacking influence. But extroverted sensing gives enjoyment of life, a zest for life, very charming. You know, that's an outer personality. You know, that's bringing people in, fun, jolly company, recounts things in a sensational way. And so then you can have kind of that influence that you want. Too much of that NI prison, that's just turning inward and reflecting all the time. And so that's not going to really impact the world, you know, if you never get into the world or never take action. And especially if you combine that with FI, it'll just be really like navel gazing, like I said. So it's so important to sprinkle in some SE. You don't want to become like an SE Dom. You don't want to become like 50-50 NI SE, but maybe try to get to like 80% of the time you're using NI, 20% of the time you're using SE. So you're sprinkling it in more of the time so that you have more influence, so that your ideas are heard. And one thing that people can do with their fourth function is it'll be absent for like a long time. They're not in SE, they're, you know, just detached. All of a sudden there's this spike and then it goes back to being absent. And that spike that happens for, you know, it could be a couple days, it could be a week, usually short-lived. That spike is called a grip. And that's when you don't have control over using your fourth function. It's just happening to you. You don't feel like you have any say. You didn't consciously call up SE. It's just happening to you. So this could be, you know, an INTJ, like absent, no SE. And all of a sudden they're going to a club and partying and drinking a lot or spending a lot of money on clothes. You know, there's a big emphasis on aesthetics, kind of a, you know, flashy clothing, you know, expensive clothes or things like that. And then boom, back to not caring about the body at all. So it's important to, instead of this oscillation between this absence and then spike, consciously raise it a little bit more of the time. So, you know, go jogging every morning or play volleyball on the weekends or go to a dance class or, you know, SE is kind of the baby of the personality, you know, give it what it needs so it doesn't start crying at you and yapping at you in destructive ways, because it'll come yapping at you and then usually it'll be destructive. So raise that bar a little bit so that you're consciously using it in constructive ways. And I feel like you don't really know someone until you know their fourth function. That was from a Marie von Franz book. She kind of had said something similar to that. Like maybe when you meet someone, you meet their first function, their second function, over time you meet their third function, but it takes a while a lot of times before someone will allow you to meet their fourth function, because there's vulnerability there. It's the inferiority complex. It's kind of scary for the individual to go into that function, especially to show people, you know, maybe when they're alone they do it, but to show people fourth function, it feels kind of vulnerable. So I always feel so grateful when people show me their fourth function. Like, you know, this onesie, you know, that's something that's not part of an INTJ stereotype. They do not show that to people very often, or, you know, any of this really. A lot of times, you know, that interest in fashion or sports, you know, that's way tucked down in there. You know, it might be a while before you really get to know an INTJ in this way. But all the types, they've got a little of the reverse personality inside them. So all the INTJs, they've got a little ESFP living inside them that they just show the people close to them. So I recommend everyone works on their second function for like 5 years, really get into that function, and then get into your fourth function for a little bit. Work on that for a couple years. And I recommend doing it for years because, you know, you'll have periods of motivation and not being motivated, and you know, each peak will be a little higher than the last, and you'll really get more bang for your buck, as opposed to, you know, I've heard of people like, oh yeah, I worked on that for 2 months and then I got all the results of it. But, you know, it really takes a while to really work on a function and get a lot of the benefits of it. And I notice people who are like 40s and up, a lot of times they have a good grasp of the appropriate ratios of all of these four functions. There's always a tendency to get in that third function. It's always just pulling you into that one-sidedness, but it's so good to just consciously always remember to get back into that TE. The antidote for that FI is that TE. So if you're interested in more INTJ content, I will have my INTJ playlist linked in the description box. That playlist has all of the videos I've ever done that could be relevant to an INTJ. So it's INTJ specific videos. It's the videos about these cognitive functions. So there's a lot of stuff in that playlist. As well as I just started a membership. So if you're interested, click the join button below this video. So yeah, thank you for your patience in waiting for this video. I always save the types that are most viewed toward the end, because as I go through a series, I'll get kind of like, oh, here's one insight I want to make sure I mention. I jot it down in my notes. Or here's another insight. So as I go through these series, they always get longer and longer and longer and a little bit more thorough and more thorough. So I try to make sure that the most viewed types get the most thorough version of what I'm creating. So yeah, thank you so much for your patience. I've been getting like requests throughout this whole series. INTJ next, INTJ next. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.